Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as the organizers of today's event, I'll welcome your attendance in solidarity with Xinjiang's victims. I extend my gratitude to all our partner organizations. A special thanks goes to Hillary Power from Human Rights Watch and our wonderful team. I stand before you with a heart both burdened and bold. I'm a human rights lawyer and a sister to Akbar Asat, an award-winning visionary tech entrepreneur whose voice is now confined behind prison camps, like many. I carry the spirit of my Brazilian community, a community that despite facing crushing weight of ethnic cleansing, cultural annihilation, and the genocide, continues to fight for its existence. My brother, like so many others, endures the torture of re-education camps, yet their spirits remain unbroken. Their courage in the face of brutal and relentless repression is a beacon of hope when those in power stay in silence and even side with their oppressors. 2 years have passed since the UN recognized the atrocities in Xinjiang as crimes against humanity, yet we see little change. Those who should be free remain confined behind the grim walls of prison camps. Meanwhile, outside, the streets of Xinjiang are adorned with welcoming slogans, a stark contrast to the harsh realities within. State-produced propaganda depicts Uyghurs dancing with joy, a cruel mockery of their suffering. Even more disheartening is the sight of UN officials led on guided tours by the Chinese government, witnessing choreographic scenes far removed from the unbearable suffering of the victims. Despite the misleading portrayal by the Chinese government and those complicit, there emerged poignant truths from within the confines of the camps, a powerful poem penned by a renowned poet, Abdulkader Jalaluddin, and memorized line by line by his fellow prisoners to transmit to the outside world. These lines echo a profound yearning for freedom and reunion with his loved ones. Through cracks and crevices, I've watched the seasons change. For news of you, I've looked in veins to buds and flowers. To the marrow of my bones, I've ached to be with you. What road led here? Why do I have no road back home? Today and day after day, we rise in solidarity for as long as it takes to ensure Professor Jalaluddin, along with millions of others, find their way home. As the world contends with multitude of crises, we must be resolute in our mission to ensure that UN and member states do not overlook the victims of a dominant authoritarian states, that one that continues to defy international law with impunity. This entails supporting the victims in their quest to justice by calling on all stakeholders to ensure every provision of the UN's recommendation is implemented. I yield the floor to my moderator. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rayhan. It's pleased to see a full room today. Welcome to all those in the room and to those that are following us online to the side event, to the 57th session of the UN Human Rights Council, titled Xinjiang Supporting Victims and Advancing the Implementation of UN Recommendations. This event is organized by the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center and the Atlantic Council, and co-sponsored by Human Rights Watch, the Yale Macmillan Center Genocide Studies Program, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, AVAZ, and my organization, the International Service for Human Rights. My name is Rafael Viana. I'm Program Manager for China at ISHR, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. We are joined today by three distinguished panelists with extensive expertise on this subject that I'd like to introduce just before kicking off our conversation. So first to my left, Priya Gopalan, who is the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Rayhan Asat, who of course just spoke, who is a Harvard Law Scholar and a Uyghur human rights lawyer at the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project. and John Fisher, well-known here in the UN hallways, Deputy Director for Global Advocacy, Human Rights Watch. A few housekeeping rules before starting very briefly. I'd like to recall that we have a zero tolerance policy for any instance of intimidation or reprisal against any of our speaker or any other civil society colleague attending this event today, in the form of oral interventions or unauthorized pictures or otherwise. And this includes, of course, any derogatory remarks against the speakers. Or any authorized filming or photographing. Please note that my colleague, my SHR colleague Francisco at the back, who's now raising his hand, is the only person authorized to take pictures aside from the press. So if you'd not like to be photographed, please kindly indicate it to him. We will have a conversation, of course, with our panelists, followed by a Q&A at the end of this event. Now, this period of the year is an important one, I think, for a lot of Uyghur advocates as we mark the 2 years since the OACHR released its damning report on the Uyghur region called the Assessment of the Human Rights Situation in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The report presented a range of findings rooted in a robust and detailed methodology that one can read in the report, including the government's own records, statistic data, laws and policies, court documents, as well as interviews with over 40 victims, a dialogue with the permanent mission of China, leaked documents considered by the OACHR to be authentic, satellite imagery, academic research, among others. The OACHR, as we know well, concluding to the possible commission of crimes against humanity in the Uyghur region on the basis of large-scale arbitrary deprivation of liberty, carried out pursuant to law and policy in context of broader restrictions and deprivation of individual and collective rights. And today we're going to be in particularly looking at the steps or lack thereof of the Chinese government in implementing the 13 key recommendations that this report has issued on a range of areas, from detention to disappearances, the right to privacy, reprisals, the destruction of mosques, and cooperation with the UN, among others. Of course, ever since the release of the report 2 years ago, a range, 3 specifically UN committees have called for the implementation of the report very explicitly in reviews of China since then, and have added a range of other recommendations that now chart the way for meaningful change in the region. And in the first part of this discussion, we were going to be looking at the extent of which those recommendations have been implemented. So first, I wanted to turn to Priya here to my left. Priya, 1 month ago, High Commissioner Volker Turk recalled the core recommendations from this Xinjiang report, including that all those arbitrarily detained are released, that all grave allegations in the camps are investigated, including torture, and that the status and whereabouts of those disappeared are clarified. Now, since 2022 only, I understand that the working group has issued 6 opinions, concluding to the arbitrary detention of 20 Uyghurs. And in each of those, I think there's a very important quote that very often doesn't reach the Human Rights Council that I'd just like to introduce and have your comment on, which is that the working group in its 30 years history has found China in violation of its obligations in numerous cases, which indicates a systemic problem with arbitrary detention, which amounts to a serious violation of international law. The working group further recalls that under certain circumstances, widespread or systematic imprisonment or other severe deprivation of liberty, in violation of the rules of international law, may constitute crimes against humanity, end of quote. Can you tell us a little bit more, Priya, about the working group's findings, and in particular the scale and the gravity of the patterns that you've documented?
Thank you, Raphael. At the outset, it's worth highlighting that the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is the only special procedure mandate that is mandated to issue opinions on the basis of individual petitions or submissions received. So those are the opinions that Raphael is referring to. Now, according to the working group's methods of work, the submissions that we receive are put to the relevant government. And in the case of the Uyghurs, these allegations are put to the government of China, who then has the opportunity to respond. As a general trend, and it is noticeable in several instances, the working group has expressed its regret that the government of China has failed to engage sufficiently or constructively or in a timely fashion by providing responses to these allegations concerning the detention of individuals in the Xinjiang region. Although, of course, it is in possession of relevant information relating to the fate of these detainees. Now, against this backdrop, the jurisprudence of the Working Group of Arbitrary Detention demonstrates a pattern of arbitrary detention against individuals of Uyghur descent. It has found that these individuals have been arbitrarily detained under several grounds of arbitrariness. And let me set those out for you today. First, the working group has found that the detention of Uyghur individuals lacked legal basis. This falls under category 1 of our methods of work. It has also found that the detention of these individuals was a result of their peaceful exercise of fundamental rights and is therefore arbitrary, falling under category 2 of its methods of work. It's found that the detention was arbitrary due to grave violations of due process rights and fair trial rights, falling under category 3 of its methods of work. Finally, under category 5 of its work, the working group has found that the arrest and detention of Uyghur individuals was a consequence of persecution, that they were targeted on a discriminatory basis because of their identity as Uyghurs, Turkic individuals, or individuals with Muslim identity or religious background. Another important aspect to highlight here is the scarcity of information and the lack of known legal proceedings that indicate to the working group that these individuals were targeted due to their ethnicity, that the ethnicity aspects of their identity was the common and discriminatory basis for their detention. Relatedly, very little is known of the trial proceedings that these individuals were subjected to, if at all. Charges, the exact legal basis of their detention, relevant legislation are largely shrouded in opacity, if not unknown, aside from vague accusations of extremism. Now, this lack of information results in extremely problematic patterns of violation. And I will highlight two. First, the exact whereabouts of many of these individuals remain unknown. The working group has found that detention in unknown locations without allowing contact with the outside world amounts to enforced disappearance. An enforced disappearance, as we know, is prohibited by international law and under the jurisprudence of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, comprises a form of aggravated arbitrary detention. Now, while it is broadly known that these individuals were forcibly sent to re-education camps, or I should say so-called re-education camps, they are often held incommunicado following their arrest, meaning they are unable to notify their family members, they are unable to communicate with anyone, they are unable to exercise their right to consult with a lawyer. Now, holding persons incommunicado violate a fundamental human right, that is the right to challenge the arbitrariness or the lawfulness of one's detention. This right is a fundamental safeguard against arbitrary detention. Finally, let me add that prolonged incommunicado detention in a secret place, which is what we see, may amount to torture under the Convention Against Torture. Now, let me conclude. What we can say is that there is a lack of basic information surrounding the arrests and arbitrary detentions of individuals of Uyghur descent. And these violations that I mentioned, whether it's allegations of torture, incommunicado detention, or aggravated detention in the form of enforced disappearances, are extremely troubling, not only because They stand in the way of any meaningful remedies, any form of accountability, but they also stand in the way of a very basic right, the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of one's liberty. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Priya, for this very solid also legal analysis of the situation. I'll turn now to you, Rayhan, on my right. Beijing has failed to provide unrestricted access to the region to UN experts over these years. And at the same time, it brings Geneva and Beijing-based diplomats to propaganda tours in the region, as you know well, and you highlighted in your opening remarks. Now, the Yale Macmillan Center for Genocide Studies program you're part of issued in August a report on the mass imprisonment of Uyghurs that it seems that a lot of them are moved from the camps to the prison system or other detention facilities. And the report concludes that it will, quote, cost Uyghurs conservatively over 4.4 million cumulative years of life, this detention in the prison system. Can you tell us a little bit more about this very strong finding?
Yes. As Priya mentioned, arbitrary detention is a major component of these human rights violations that China is committing. But China adopts this adaptive authoritarianism mechanism where it relies on patient-client relationship and as well as the broader network to commit its atrocities. And because it's an adaptive authoritarianism, the state's tactics of oppression changes with time and international scrutiny. What we really try to do is to contextualize the current phase of the atrocity crimes. As many of you know, behind one of the things that what makes the China's atrocity crime is so outrageous is a state technology, sophisticated technology-enabled atrocity crimes. Because of that, the opaque system makes it very difficult to get the information out. So we really try to, in our effort to contextualize this current phase where laws are deployed to commit atrocities, as scholars argue China's system as the maximum reach of authoritarian legality. Law has one purpose, that is to legalize and legitimizes human rights oppression. So in coming up this very conservative number, 4.4 million years of Uyghur lives would be taken away if the atrocities are not deterred. We really relied on primarily Chinese government's own data. Despite that, the Uyghurs and other non-Han people make up just 1% of the China's overall population. According to China's own document, they account for 34% of the China's estimated prison population. That should give us a pause just right there. Since 2017 to 2022, the ethnic minorities in Xinjiang are imprisoned at a rate of 47% times greater than Han people. The primary source that we relied on actually came from the Xinjiang's courts itself. From 2017 to 2022, the Chinese government released persecution rate, and the conviction rate is at 99%. So the number was given is more than 500,000 people are persecuted. With that conviction rate, and then finding on average people are facing 8 to 9 years imprisonment, this number is far more conservative. So while the UN officials or representatives from these states go on to these tours, often it is guided tour, and we know that for a fact. And as well as China is relying on these vloggers, like YouTubers, to come and portray the Uyghur region as just a wonderful promised land, the reality is happening behind the bars. And the imprisonment, it gives you this illusory sense of these are real criminals are behind the camps, but that's not true. And that is something that Priya has already mentioned. So I really strongly urge everybody to read this report. It's actually viewed by many scholars, including the Yale Genocide Studies Program Director, Professor David Simon, a leading scholar of genocide studies. And ultimately, laws cannot be served for this kind of purpose, to brutally repress its people. And especially if you're an individual given 15 to 20 years, that crushes you. That crushes you ever coming out. Initially, it started with extrajudicial. You know, if you're a victim, you may think maybe one day I would come out. But the minute you receive 15 to 20 years in your prison cell without even a court hearing, trial, or any access to lawyer, what happens with that system? And that is the maximum reach of authority and legality. And ultimately, what really ends up happening is that we're going to face the rise of authoritarian international law, where China's expanding its counterterrorism framework by including the right to self-determination as a form of terrorism. And this is why what's happening in Xinjiang has international law ramifications, and we must resist that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rayhan. And this mass imprisonment that you mentioned is also grounded in, of course, a very specific legal framework. And not earlier than a month ago, the High Commissioner in this public remarks about his work on China, specifically stated that the many problematic laws and policies that are documented in the report remain in place, even after 2 years. Now I'll turn to you, John, as the OECHR's report includes a range of other recommendations on other areas of grave concern, such as cultural erasure, the destruction of cultural heritage, surveillance, and the collection of data, among others. Do these correspond to Human Rights Watch's own research? And to what extent do these abuses reflect ongoing patterns of behavior?
Thank you, Raphael. And I appreciate the question, because while the High Commissioner's report lays bare a broad range of human rights violations directed against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, including, of course, arbitrary detention on a massive scale, torture, involuntary medical treatment, forced labor, family separation, interference with reproductive rights, intimidation, threats, and reprisals. One common thread running throughout the report and the violations is the systematic suppression of Uyghur and other culture, language, religion, and identity. And when we refer to patterns of conduct and abuses, it's clear that these abuses were taking place long before the camps, long before the High Commissioner's report, that organizations like Human Rights Watch and other NGOs were documenting this crackdown on cultural rights and freedom of religion, identity, expression for many years. And in fact, in preparation for this panel, I was going through our files and came across this report that Human Rights Watch issued in 2001, so 23 years ago, where we expressed concerns about the rise and violations of freedom of religion, considerably increasing in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. We noted recent increases in measures introduced by the Chinese authorities that required religious institutions and imams to be authorized by the state, that required religious leaders to undergo patriotic education courses, that documented retribution against imams and other religious leaders who failed to follow the dictates of the state. Government media reported in May of that year 7 imams who were arrested and 2 so-called underground mosques that were destroyed in Urumqi, and charges that were formally laid. At the same time, students at schools and universities were forbidden to pray, to keep the fast during Ramadan, or to show any pious behavior. Sound familiar? And what we saw in the years following that report was a systematic tightening of the screws, as Chinese authorities and authorities in Xinjiang systematically introduced legislation, laws, policies, and practices that sought to regulate the practice of Islam, that used and misused counterterrorism and anti-extremism laws in order to identify as potential extremists people who were exercising the peaceful practice of their religion. We saw guidelines and regulations introduced that gave indicators of possible extremism, which included the wearing by men of long beards, by women of veils, that sought to criminalize and to restrict peaceful expressions of prayer, religious worship, the use of the Uyghur language, and exercises of culture and religion. And we also saw, accompanying that, widespread use of checkpoints, of massive surveillance, of systematic data gathering, and other means in order to seek to enforce these laws. And then, of course, came the detention centers and the camps. And we've heard much there about the massive use of arbitrary detention, the restrictions in that regard. The High Commissioner's report is landmark in the sense that it details the scope and extent of this. It identifies, as we all know, that the restrictions rise or may rise to the level of crimes against humanity. And it also laid bare the kinds of violations that were experienced by people, and why, while rightly so, there's been much attention on the arbitrary detentions and the mistreatment and inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment within the detention centers. Throughout the report, the High Commissioner also documents the restrictions on culture, language, religion, and identity. I mean, for example, the report also looks at some of the indicia established by the Chinese authorities themselves and their own policy materials that indicate that wearing hijabs and a normal beard is a sign of extremism, closing restaurants during Ramadan, learning the Quran, giving one's child a Muslim name, and other conduct which the High Commissioner described as, and this is a quote, nothing more or less than personal choice in the practice of Islamic religious beliefs and all legitimate expression of opinion. Within the detention centers themselves, detainees were prohibited from practicing their religion, praying, or speaking their language. Instead, there was a strong emphasis on what were called political teachings and so-called rehabilitation through self-criticism. One detainee said, "We were forced to sing patriotic song after patriotic song every day, as loud as possible and until it hurts, until our faces became red and our veins appeared on our face." So it was clear that the camps themselves were part of a systematic attempt at mass assimilation and to erase the ability of detainees to practice their own religion, to speak their language, to exercise their faith. This was accompanied by reports of, as the High Commissioner put it, destruction of Islamic religious sites such as mosques, shrines, and cemeteries, which we documented, as I pointed out, 23 years ago, and which we continue to document to this day. The report also looks at homestay programs in which Chinese authorities were placed with families in the Xinjiang region, and where a number of those interviewed said that they felt unable to speak their own language, to exercise their religion or their faith, to pray for fear of reprisals or being sent to the vocational training centers, as they were euphemistically called at the time, but as we all know were mass detention centers from which there was no voluntary ability to leave. In the time since the report was issued, which, let's face it, was only 2 years ago, so it's unrealistic, I think, and naive to think that a practice of systemic suppression of culture and religion that has been continuing for decades would have changed in just the last couple of years, and that the authorities would now embrace the diversity of the region or celebrate Uyghur language or culture or religion. But just in the past couple of years, Human Rights Watch has documented continuing use of mass surveillance and collection of phone records and data in order to suppress Uyghur rights, including software that dubs readings from the Quran to be harmful. There was in January of this year, we released a report on new laws that sought to tighten regulations and religious restrictions for Uyghurs, which now require that religions practice the core values of socialism and adhere to the direction of Sinicization of religions, as the regulations say. Whenever places of worship are being built, renovated, expanded, or rebuilt, the regulations say they should reflect Chinese characteristics and style in terms of architecture, sculptures, painting, decorations, etc. The regulations also go to the content of what is taught and require that it be in conformity with the state dictates. In June of this year, we issued a report that documented hundreds of Uyghur village names being changed. So many many villages with Uyghur place names were renamed with new names like happiness, unity, and harmony, and anything referring to historical Uyghur names, figures, or in some cases words like palace or sultan, cultural practices were erased from the Uyghur place names. We also documented in terms of looking at patterns of conduct, mosques being destroyed in a number of other provinces, hundreds in recent years. And this is all, of course, in a context where similar kinds of restrictions and suppression of identity, religion, language, and traditions can be viewed in Tibet. We've seen the use of security legislation in Hong Kong to suppress rights and freedoms. And so it is clear that we are looking at patterns of conduct that have been practiced for many years, were well documented by the High Commission's report. Human Rights Watch shares the conclusion that these rise to the level of crimes against humanity, and it's clear that these violations continue to this day. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And something that I think that you highlight that we've not seen that much reporting on here at the UN, but it is a very important point to consider is all these restrictions that are widespread and systematic and that prevent the transmission of culture, religious policy. Thank you so much, the three of you, for your remarks on this first round of questions. I think it's clear that the recommendations related to the substance of the situation on the ground have not been implemented, and in most of them, if not all, measures have been taken against the spirit of those recommendations. The report also lists a range of recommendations related to cooperation with the UN. Priya, you touched upon this in terms of the lack of information and the cooperation with the working group. Just to name a few, of course, the OACHR asks that reprisals stop. Just last week, we were discussing in the dialogue with the ASG, where China was evidently one of the top and remains one of the top perpetrators of reprisals against those who cooperate with the UN. The ratification of international treaties such as the ICCPR, which has not happened, nor any step in that direction. The provision of unrestricted access to special rapporteurs and working groups, including yours, Priya. So there's a specific list that is in the report. None of them have been invited nor, of course, accepted. And on the contrary, a recent visit by the rapporteur on UCMs was rather aimed at spinning the narrative and not actually addressing the recommendations that are in the OACHR report. And of course, the engagement with the OACHR, which is of course grounded on China's sustained position that that report is China's rejection of that report, let's say. This year, of course, we had China's UPR, where 40% of recommendations were rejected, an increase since 2018, including all recommendations related to the implementation of the OACHR report, treaty bodies, special procedures. Now, against this backdrop, we have the eternal question that brings us today and every council session with what now? So I'll first perhaps turn to you, Priya, in particular, because UN special procedures have played this key role over the years in ensuring a meaningful documentation of the widespread and systematic abuses in the region, reminding China of its obligations through letters, through opinions, through statements. And 2 years ago in December, your mandate joined a letter to the government that including 7 benchmarks on what to do on the Uyghur region. So moving forward, what would be meaningful steps that China should take as a matter of priority to cooperate fully with the United Nations and implement those UN recommendations? And what obligations do other member states have in this regard?
Thank you, Raphael. At the outset, I would really want to emphasize the significance, the importance of ending reprisals and intimidation. Raphael has mentioned it already, but it is a point worth highlighting and reiterating. Whether it's against lawyers who are seeking to assist Uyghur individuals, whether it's those who are cooperating with the United Nations, whether it's family members of detainees who are trying to obtain information, it has to stop. That would be the first matter of priority. Now, the second, I would turn to the High Commissioner's report of 2022, where there was documented the persistent failure of authorities to provide any information concerning the detention of individuals belonging to the Uyghur minority group and the near impossibility for their family members or others to ascertain the fate of the detainees. Now, this paragraph really resonates with the poem that Rayhan started out with. This lack of knowledge, lack of any contact has been highlighted as being particularly painful for family members, whether they are in country or living geographically abroad. And from the perspective of the working group, in some cases, we've received information that entire families have been placed in these detention camps, mothers and fathers, daughters, and their children, siblings, in a range of ages, from an elderly man in his 80s to a minor. This is something that we have received information on, and we are deeply concerned by what seems to be a revolving door, this practice of detaining and releasing family members through arrest and release. And with these observations, whether from the High Commissioner or from the observations of the working group, we call upon the government of China to take prompt steps to release all individuals arbitrarily detained of their liberty in Xinjiang, and also to urgently clarify the whereabouts of missing family members and to facilitate their safe contact and return. Now, the third issue I'd like to highlight, and again, Rayhan alluded to it, the legal framework. And in this case, the misuse of counterterrorism, anti-extremism legislation, national security legislation as a tool for political repression and as a means to deny the exercise of fundamental rights. The working group has found in its opinions that the detention of individuals of Uyghur ethnicity was arbitrary because it was based on broad, very vague counterterrorism legislation. Now, ethnic Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities are being held, often for long periods, without being charged or tried under the pretext of countering religious extremism. Against this backdrop, let me emphasize that the issue of the misapplication and abuse of such legislation, whether it's anti-terrorism, anti-extremism, or national security legislation, is not unique to China. And it is a trend that the working group observes in a large number of its opinions across a broad range of member states across the 5 geographical regions that it covers. And this is a worsening trend, a regrettable trend that results in the stifling of peaceful expression of fundamental rights and even political dissent. And against this backdrop, my final point is to highlight the significance of the universality of the rule of law and the impartial application of international law in all contexts. We know that such a principled approach will yield dividends in the long run by protecting the rule of law in international affairs and by promoting and protecting the human rights for all without discrimination. When international law, when human rights law is applied selectively, the moral authority, the moral leadership that is imbued in law that underscores its compliance is lost. And we then risk compromising the foundation of rule-based order in this world. So in answer to the question that you asked, Raphael, what obligations do other member states have in this regard? I would say, and I'll conclude by quoting Dr. Emery Brown, Trinidad and Tobago's Minister of Foreign Affairs, his words during his address to the UN General Assembly. International law is not a tool of mere convenience to be muted for friends and trumpeted against enemies. As such, I would call upon states, all other states, to uphold human rights without discrimination. And to the government of China, I would call upon it to undertake a full and independent investigation into the circumstances surrounding the arbitrary deprivation of liberty of Uyghur individuals and to take appropriate measures against those responsible for these violations. Those detained must be released immediately and accorded an enforceable right to compensation and other reparations. Indeed, these are the recommendations that are made by the working group in its opinions to governments. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priya. I'll turn now to you, Rayhan, because another day that we remember well 2 years ago was the Human Rights Council's failure to adopt a resolution merely calling for a discussion of this landmark OAC job report by a very narrow margin of votes, unfortunately enabled by votes against by Muslim-majority countries such as Qatar, Indonesia, or Kazakhstan, or the abstention of Global South democracies such as Brazil or Mexico or Argentina who deviated from traditional support to human rights. That's something we've discussed a lot, right? And in the meantime, it's clear from today's conversation that China has not implemented this UN report. So what is your message to states that are present in the room today, or perhaps also to the ones that are intentionally absent?
First, I am pleased to see, some of the ambassadors from Global South countries in presence to listen to us. Referring to Rafael's comment about this resolution that could have potentially changed the lives of the Uyghurs, the silence of the global majority countries speaks to the very fact that we're dealing with a norm entrepreneur that the world has not ever seen, and that is China. The institutional capture of the United Nations and these kind of international organizations, as well as deployment of China's own regional organizations, because of its outside economic power, we have the Shanghai Regional Cooperation Organizations, where these laws are embedded to become a regional law and has the very potential to become regional customary international law, should really compel us to think about what is happening at these international institutions. The Uyghurs and other Turkic groups are facing a dominant authoritarian power. It's a colonial power that brutally repressing them. The victims stand no chance against this power. And if the Chinese government claims that everybody is released, everything is wonderful in China, then allowing the UN High Commissioner, as well as UN Special Procedure, and as well as Human Rights Watch, all the civil society, including Uyghurs like me, access to the region to conduct independent investigation, would also exonerate China if the atrocities, crimes are allegedly false, that we're just here to making up these lies. But that's not true, and we very much know that. And a lot of countries have been very vocal on other atrocity crimes or war crimes against other Muslim population. And double standards has been something that every countries has been accusing each other. But ultimately, human rights values are universal. We cannot pick, choose where we're going to be very outspoken against a particular group and then completely betray against the other group. All victims don't suffer because of the skin color of the perpetrator or the dominant power of the perpetrator. So my hope is that, especially countries from the Global South, African bloc, or Middle Eastern countries, please, we have to stop this double standards. Uyghurs are suffering immeasurably. And when you're not the family member of the victim, you can never understand what's going on. As a human rights lawyer, when I documented this, when I produced this Yale report, I had to wipe out my tears every second, because what I hear is that when a prisoner was singing to seek potential, even like some sort of grievances in the camp or trying to keep up his mental health, what the Chinese government is added 7-year sentence to his already 16-year sentence. And that's the kind of environment that victims are under. So the UN's recommendation is robust. Implementing it would ultimately end this crisis. And then we can begin to talk about reparations. Because the atrocity crime is so ongoing, we haven't even begun to talk about these future steps to heal the Uyghur community who has gone through this brutal repression for nearly a decade now. So that is my message, that we have to uphold these values universally, and double standards should have no place at the UN. And last point, when I met one African diplomat, something that I said truly moved him. In Africa, there's a very famous proverb that goes, until you hear the lion's version, you're confronted with hunter's version. And I encourage everybody from the Global South countries to meet with civil society, Uyghur representatives, victims, to hear their stories and learn what's happening, not just from the Chinese government's own mouths. You need to meet with people, victims, to learn what's really happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Rayhan. Thank you so much. And perhaps lastly, John, a question to you, which is now related to what can other UN bodies do, as it's been a couple of years that we've had statements from special procedures, 3 UN committees that have backed up the OACHR's findings. What else can UN bodies do to promote accountability for abuses and justice for victims?
Thank you, Raphael. And you're correct that there have been a number of appeals from various UN bodies for action. And when you ask what else can they do, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, we can start by ensuring that states and UN bodies address the basics and carry out the kinds of follow-up activities that have already been identified in a number of those materials. The High Commissioner's report lays out a blueprint for what needs to change. We've seen joint statements by upwards of 50 special procedures laying out the laws and policies that need to change and the actions expected of the international community. They've suggested creation of some kind of international investigative or monitoring mechanism. They've looked at the tools of the Human Rights Council, like urgent debates or special sessions. You mentioned that in the wake of the High Commissioner's report, there was, as we know, a draft decision or resolution that came within 2 votes of being adopted by the Human Rights Council. And the next day, one state, Ukraine, said they would have liked to have voted in favor, which have brought us within a single vote of that. So a different Human Rights Council, differently composed, or with greater principle and integrity from some of those states that voted against the resolution or that abstained, would have meant that report would have been discussed by the Human Rights Council. And our expectation is that when the High Commissioner issues a report documenting violations so widespread, they may well arise to the level of crimes against humanity, the least we expect of the Human Rights Council, in all credibility, is to talk about it. And we feel it's extremely important that we not lose sight of that objective and we not let it lapse from the HRC agenda. I know that some states have a critical view of that draft decision and feel that because it wasn't adopted, perhaps was it the right thing to do? I have not myself spoken to a single civil society representative or human rights defender who thought it was a mistake. The alternative would have been for the High Commissioner's report to have passed in complete silence with no attention by the Human Rights Council. And we all know that in any body like the Human Rights Council, success is not guaranteed, but the only failure is the failure to try. So we look to states to ensure that there is meaningful follow-up to that report, that the recommendations are implemented, to take every opportunity you can, both in multilateral fora and in your bilateral relations, to speak out both privately and publicly. We welcome the fact that on the 2-year anniversary of the report, the High Commissioner issued a statement making very clear that while he engages regularly with Chinese authorities, the laws, policies, and practices that have contributed to this systemic oppression remain in place. And he talked about his commitment to continued engagement with the government of China. So we welcome continued engagement, but it's very clear also that will not lead to meaningful results. China's response to the report has been to describe it as illegal and void, to describe it as based on fabrication and lies, and to deny the allegations, even though they were based on their own materials and policy principles. So we look to states to ensure that there is meaningful follow-up, that they raise the issue. It's unfortunate. I mean, we welcome that there was a statement by the core group on China at the recent session or at the current session of the Human Rights Council. We look to states in New York to ensure that there is a broad sign-on statement at the GA, as there has been in recent years. We also feel it's incredibly important that in the absence of meaningful political action, that increases the responsibility of the High Commissioner and Special Procedures to commit to continued monitoring and public reporting. We also feel it's important to track and identify identify victims, the missing, the disappeared, and for states to be able to raise those cases with the Chinese authorities consistently and publicly, and that there be some systemic way of doing that and tracking those who are detained and disappeared. And finally, as well, for every violation, there is a perpetrator. And so it's important to identify those who continue to be responsible for crimes against humanity, to call them out for that, and to look at the range of tools, including sanctions, to ensure that those responsible are held to account. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. I wished we had a little bit more time for an interaction, but back-to-back events in the same room is always a challenge in terms of timing, but I did want to make sure that we could at least hear one or two remarks, very brief, 1 minute maximum from the floor in case there is. So I just wanted to open the floor. Yes, please state your affiliation. Thank you.
I'm from UNA China, United Nations Association of China. I have been to Xinjiang many times, and many of my friends also visit China and came back with beautiful memories. And I also have a lot of friends in Xinjiang. And people of all ethnic groups in Xinjiang enjoy intensive democratic rights, the right to development, and the right to a better life. So I should say the accusation against Xinjiang in this side event is full of lies, rumors, and disinformation. I wonder whether you have read the report on the negative impacts of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights of China submitted by Special Rapporteur Madame Alina Dohan to this regular session on her visit to China. The report points out that UCMs imposed by the US and other countries against China violated international law and have a negative impact on various human rights, such as economic, social, and cultural rights.
Sorry, I will ask you, we have to wrap up soon, so I'll ask you to go to your question if you have a question. Otherwise, I'll have to go to the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, so my question is, have you ever been to China? Because your presentation are full of lies and rumors and disinformation. And my second question is, as NGOs based in the United States, Iran Human Rights Documentation Center and Human Rights Watch, you should pay more attention to the human rights situation in the United States, such as racism, gun violence, social justice, injustice.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll have to wrap up. I noted your question. Thank you so much. I recognize United Kingdom.
Very much. For those of you who haven't met, I'm Eleanor Sanders. I've recently arrived here in Geneva as the Human Rights Ambassador for the UK, based in Geneva, but I have a global remit. I'll be very brief, but just to say huge thanks to all of you for presenting today and for all of the work that you continue to do on this issue. I'm conscious that people are continuing to ask, why are we still looking at this report and talking about this report 2 years after its release? And I think you have answered that question more than enough through what you presented to us today. We're conscious that the report was put together painstakingly using very careful methods, and much of the substance came from China's own records. So we agree with you, it's important we continue to take heed and advance the recommendations in the report. My question would be, particularly Rayhan, picking up on your point about the Global South and other parts of the world who may not be represented in quite such numbers here in this room, what more can we do together to raise awareness and engage on these issues with the Global South and elsewhere around the world? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will have to wrap up, so I'm sure that we can continue the conversation outside, but just on behalf of, I think, the whole panel, I'd like to give the floor back to Rayhan for perhaps 1 minute concluding remarks.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, as a civil society, we met with many representatives from Global South countries in Geneva. And one thing I realized that when they meet with civil society, they do realize how serious this issue is, especially given UN's own documentation. But there is a disconnect between Geneva mission and as well as the capital, which often makes a decision based on the trade priorities and China's economic coercion. So we need to make sure that, you know, when we talk to these like missions in Geneva, they are the champions of human rights values. But at the same time, when I invite countries to talk to their capital as well, that disconnect has to be dismantled, without which the current human rights atrocities will continue. So I hope that there is a better engagement between the Geneva and as well as capital. And we need to make sure that both civil society and other countries, all stakeholders work together to end the ongoing atrocity crimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much who has joined us today in the room and everyone that has joined us virtually. And I wish you an excellent afternoon. Thank you.